Introduction to Section 2, Chapter 11, 3 Levels of Emotional Adaptation. Voluntary Neuroplasticity. It is my sincere belief that, throughout the generations, life was extremely difficult, and most of our ancestors struggled to stay alive. Because if we took the time to look back throughout our human history, we would recognise that it took a great deal of survival skills to provide our families with comfort, warmth, security and protection, and enough food for all of our ancestors to remain healthy and to survive. Because throughout the generations, these were basic needs, supplied mostly by living off the land with simple wholesome foods and a simple roof over our ancestors' heads. But this would have tested our ancestors throughout the generations, through the different seasons and harsh climatic conditions, not to mention all of the thousands of different conflicts, battles and wars our ancestors had to fight throughout the generations. And this would have caused many different ego survival emotions to become dominantly stored into our ancestors' long-term memories. However, we must not forget also that for millions of years before money was invented, most communities would have relied entirely on each other for their own individual and close families' protection and survival. For instance, all communities would share different skills with each other. Some people provided agricultural crops and food for the community. Some provided carpentry or building skills. Some provided medical help for the community. Everyone had a role and a skill, and everyone had to work together and help the community survive, unless, of course, people were old or sick. And this is how, for thousands of generations before money was invented, people in these communities also developed their altruistic emotions of empathy, compassion and loving kindness for each other, and generosity of their human spirit towards each other, so that they gained heightened awareness that enabled them to recognize others' suffering. This is why our altruistic emotions and behavioral patterns are associated with the emotions and behaviors of the collective consciousness. However, because life for most generations was extremely difficult, our ancestors' ego emotions took over control in the long-term memory to suppress many of these more advanced, positive and peaceful, highly evolved altruistic emotions of the collective consciousness. And this is especially relevant in our modern world today, because for the last few thousand years we have all relied entirely on money for our own individual and close family survival, instead of each other, in order to supply all of these basic survival needs. This is the reason that life is much more difficult in our modern world today, because we can no longer turn for help from each other. Instead, we have to rely entirely on money to do this for us. But all of these different money worries feed, drive, control and increase all of our different ego survival emotions. So how can we break this generational suffering? In other words, how can we begin to release and heal all of our old ego emotional wounds and suffering, so that we all instead begin to function dominantly in our long-term memories through the emotions and behaviours of the collective consciousness, so that we can all begin to live in collective peace, blissful happiness and harmony with each other, free from all ego emotions. And at the same time, how can we all begin to live an existence that allows us to begin to experience this ultimate level of existence through a heightened sense of wellness, blissful happiness, peace and healing within ourselves? These will be the discussions for this very small section 2 of this book, because throughout the second half of this book, we are now going to discuss 3 brand new levels for our own individual emotional adaptation, that, by the way, can only be achieved through the help of voluntary neuroplasticity. This is why we are now going to spend this very important but very short chapter discussing how we can activate voluntary neuroplasticity through the help of our working memory and certain priming techniques. But to help and guide us through a few scientific details, we are now going to give an example of a small group of very gentle people that have already spent many years practicing altruism in order to develop into their long-term memory these altruistic emotions and behavioural patterns of the collective consciousness. And this is why a few independent scientific research experts have already established some very important findings and have learnt a great deal from these gentle and peaceful Tibetan Buddhist monks. However, before we begin, it is important to recognise that this research has only been provided to help us to find the solutions to practice voluntary neuroplasticity, because as mentioned earlier, I do not practice any religion simply because I do not want any of my own ego emotions to try to take over control in my long-term memory and begin ego competitive behaviours with any other person's different religious beliefs. But we mustn't forget also that all of these 3 levels of emotional adaptations can only be achieved through this complex process that neuroscience experts refer to as neuroplasticity. But this time, this will be voluntary neuroplasticity. In other words, we will all know that we are making these emotional adaptations, whereas throughout our early childhoods, we all began to activate involuntary neuroplasticity that most of us were unaware of, but stored these childhood emotions into our long-term memories. This is the reason that we are now going to spend the rest of this chapter discussing this very special group of Tibetan Buddhist monks who have already practiced voluntary neuroplasticity to such an extent that many of them have already found the solutions to release and heal all of their ego emotions, and instead have developed these highly evolved altruistic emotions to become dominantly stored into their long-term memories that allow many of them to already live this ultimate level of existence through a heightened sense of wellness, blissful happiness, peace, and healing within themselves. Science experts spent a great deal of time using independent scientific research studies to identify what areas in the brain these special Tibetan Buddhist monks accessed in order to allow their working memory to activate neuroplasticity and to allow these advanced altruistic emotions to become dominantly stored into their long-term memories. However, none of these brand new practices can even begin to take place without us first finding powerful enough focused attention and user-friendly practical solutions that can help us all to activate this very special process in our brains called voluntary neuroplasticity. And this is where it gets a little complicated, because it's extremely important for us to recognise that none of these practical solutions that we are going to discuss shortly can ever take place unless we are able to first find practical techniques that will be focused enough to distract our dominant ego emotions for long enough periods of time so that we can begin activating these brand new voluntary emotions. And this is the challenge, because as we have already mentioned many times throughout this book, we currently have no idea the power, strength and control of our own set of individual adult ego behavioural patterns. This is why we need to turn for help and guidance from these independent scientific research studies that, by the way, can be found in the index. These important science experts studied the brains of some of these very gentle Tibetan Buddhist monks that provided us all with some very big clues how we can all begin to first release and heal all of our old, different adult ego behavioural patterns from taking over control in our long-term memories, so that we can allow instead a brand new set of highly evolved altruistic emotions and behaviours of the collective consciousness to become stored dominantly into our long-term memories. So far throughout this book, we have explained each step using as many simplified scientific details as possible, and we will continue in this manner throughout the rest of this book. However, neuroscience experts are well aware that our brains are far more complex, and this is the reason that some of these expert Tibetan Buddhist monks have taken a lifetime of focused practice and dedicated their entire lives to focusing their attention and thought patterns on establishing the development of these advanced, highly evolved altruistic emotions to become dominantly stored into their long-term memories through spending thousands of hours and many years of daily focused attention, mindful meditation practices to develop these highly evolved altruistic emotions. But why is it that these gentle Tibetan Buddhist monks can only practice these very special, advanced, highly evolved altruistic emotions only through the techniques of using these focused attention, mindful meditation practices? Because so far, these are the only techniques that mankind has ever found that has enough focused attention that can distract our ego emotions for long enough periods of time to instead initiate this very important process, neuroplasticity. Because focused attention, mindful meditation, if practiced enough and for a very long period of time, without breaks in its daily routine consistency, allows the working memory to activate some brand new, highly evolved altruistic, voluntary emotions to become dominantly stored into these very special Tibetan Buddhist monks' long-term memories. This is why these focused attention, mindful meditation practices practiced by these gentle Tibetan Buddhist monks will one day help us all and teach us all how we can all develop some of these very special, advanced, highly evolved altruistic emotions to become dominantly stored into our long-term memories. However, currently, these daily focused attention, mindful meditation practices are not a quick fix or an easy process. This is why we must all acknowledge that these discussions are simply the initial beginnings of these discussions, and a great deal of further research is now needed by a new team of neuroscience experts to begin research and discover some brand new user-friendly methods for us all to begin to practice these techniques in a much shorter time span, so that we can all benefit from these practices, so that we can all begin to advance and transform all of our lives in a much quicker time span, rather than spending many thousands of hours and many years of practices like these self-disciplined and dedicated Tibetan Buddhist monks. Because most of us now live in highly overpopulated areas, in big towns and cities, and with so much noise pollution, none of our adult ego behavioural patterns would currently allow our long-term memories to find the peace and silence to dedicate many hours of daily practice and time discipline and determination to spend many thousands of hours and many years in these daily focused attention mindful meditation practices. At the same time, many of us are interacting with different people in our normal everyday daily lives, and by doing so, it is easy for us to activate many of our different ego emotions through many different difficult face-to-face interactions with each other, different difficult fear-based media news, different difficult fear-based social media, fear-based movies, fear-based computer games, fear-based books, etc. As we have already discussed throughout the first half of this book. All of these reasons mean that we are all experiencing so much fear and noise pollution in our lives that most of us currently have no time for our brains to relax and to find time for these self-disciplined practices of silence and peace. Especially now that most of us are struggling to survive in order to find financial and health solutions for our own individual and close family survival, that brings even further increases in many of our different ego fears, ego stress, ego anxieties, ego worries, etc. And that is why many of us simply don't have the time, determination, dedication, and focused attention, or even inclination to make these drastic lifestyle changes and to dedicate our busy lives to thousands of hours of daily focused attention, mindful meditation practices. This is why we all need the help of a brand new team of neuroscience experts to come together to begin to invent some user-friendly practical solutions that every single person can take advantage of, that will be based on 3 levels of our own individual emotional adaptations. This is why we must first begin to understand what areas in our brain these special group of Tibetan Buddhist monks became activated throughout these thousands of hours and many years of these focused attention mindful meditation practices. This is the reason that it's now going to get a little more complicated. So bear with me, because scientists have now discovered that in order to initiate these focused attention mindful meditation practices, scientists observed that the brains of these very special, gentle and peaceful group of Tibetan Buddhist monks, while practicing these techniques, were not accessing one part of the brain, but multiple parts of their brain, located in the frontal lobe. So what are these multiple parts in our brain? Through these independent scientific research studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging that measures the small changes in blood flow that occurred with these Tibetan Buddhist monks' brain activity, scientists were able to observe where these particular areas in their brain were located. In other words, what parts in their brains were being activated when practicing focused attention, mindful meditation practices and techniques. This was important to recognize because these were some of the most skilled and experienced mindful meditation practitioners in the world. The more skilled a practitioner became, the more they were able to focus their attention on these particular highly evolved altruistic emotions. And as explained earlier, details of this scientific transcript can be found in the index. However, I am going to draw your attention to a very small but very important part of these research findings. Buddha's brain, neuroplasticity and meditation. A recent study used functional magnetic resonance imaging to interrogate the neural correlates of focused attention meditation in experts and novices. The study compared focused attention meditation on an external visual point to a rest condition during which participants do not use meditation and are simply instructed to adopt a neutral baseline state. The meditation condition was associated with activation in multiple brain regions implicated in monitoring: dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, engaging attention, in other words, visual cortex, and attentional orienting, for example, the superior frontal sulcus, the supplementary motor area, and the intraparietal sulcus. Although this meditation-related activation pattern was generally stronger for long-term practitioners compared to novices, activity in many brain areas involved in focused attention meditation showed an inverted U-shaped curve on the graph for both classes of subjects, whereas expert meditators with an average of 19,000 hours of practice showed stronger activation in these areas than the novices. Expert meditators with an average of 44,000 practice hours showed less activation. This inverted U-shaped function resembles the learning curve associated with skill acquisition in other domains of expertise, such as language acquisition. The findings support the idea that, after extensive focused attention meditation training, minimal effort is necessary to sustain attentional focus. Expert meditators also showed less activation than novices in the amygdala during the focused attention meditation in response to emotional sounds. Activation in this affective region correlated negatively with hours of practice in life, as shown in Figure 1.A. This finding may support the idea that advanced levels of concentration are associated with a significant decrease in emotional reactive behaviours that are incompatible with stability of concentration. In other words, in simple terms, what these findings have identified is that the more 44,000 hours of practice these expert meditators had obtained, the less they needed to focus their attention. This is because neuroplasticity had permanently stored these voluntary, altruistic emotions to become more dominantly stored emotions in their long-term memories, and therefore the less ego emotions they had stored in their long-term memories, and therefore the less they were able to activate their genetic memory, the amygdala, that stores all of our different ancestors' emotional fears and extreme emotional aggression, etc. We also know from these findings that many of these areas in the brain throughout these focused attention mindful meditation practices activates our working memory. There are hundreds of different meditation techniques that many of us currently practice all over the world today. However, I will remind you again that meditation is not a technique that can help release and heal all of our own individual and different ego emotions, or even develop some brand new, positive, highly evolved altruistic emotions, unless we are able to invent very specific, user-friendly, focused attention, mindful, daily discipline practices that are powerful enough to distract our more dominant adult ego behavioural patterns stored in our long-term memory. So what had these independent scientific research studies discovered about the brains of these gentle Tibetan Buddhist monks? Some expert meditators with an average of 44,000 practiced hours began to show less activation in this area in the brain, the amygdala. And this is because they had focused their attention for so many thousands of hours that their thought patterns were now entirely focused on emotions of altruism, empathy, compassion, loving kindness, peace, and generosity of their human spirit towards all others that they focused their attention on. And this is how, after many thousands of hours of practice, they began to develop two of the most advanced emotional attributes that can be found in any of our human behaviours. First, they found the practical solutions to release and heal their own set of ego emotions that were previously more dominantly stored in their long-term memories. And second, once they had achieved success, this is when these previously dominant ego emotions were no longer able to activate some of their more extreme, aggressive, or even sometimes violent emotional reactions that can be found in this area in our brain, the amygdala. And once practiced for a long enough period of time, for over 40,000 hours, in order to achieve dominance in their long-term memories with these highly evolved altruistic emotions, this meant that their now dominant, highly evolved altruistic thought patterns were only able to behave, think, reason, make decisions, and react only with highly evolved altruistic emotions, as explained throughout these independent scientific research studies. And this is how they began to experience a heightened sense of wellness, a higher state and higher states of blissful happiness and peace within themselves. So how did they achieve this? Do you remember when we discussed in the first half of this book how our thought patterns, energy waves, transforms into our own material realities, mass? This is how, just like a boomerang, quantum theory of non-locality allowed some of these expert meditators who spent more than 40,000 hours in focused attention, mindful meditation practices, to focus their now dominant altruistic thought patterns, energy waves, so that these invisible signals of these energy waves began to transform these energy waves into exalted states of pure bliss, peace, harmony, and complete happiness for themselves, mass. This is how these very special and gentle Tibetan Buddhist monks were literally changing their own material lives so that they felt as though they were living in Shangri-La. In other words, they were so happy and at peace that they felt as though they were living each day in paradise here on earth. But these were not the only enormous attributes, because these expert Tibetan Buddhist monks had been focusing their attention for many thousands of hours through sending dominant emotions of altruism, empathy, loving kindness and compassion for all others more vulnerable and suffering. And this is how they developed a heightened sense of awareness. In other words, instead of focusing their attention on self, the personal I am ego self, their heightened aware altruistic emotions began to focus all of their thoughts and attention on others in order to help others more vulnerable and suffering. And by doing so, their altruistic thought patterns were sending out waves of energy, and by doing so, helping to transform the material realities for these more vulnerable people, mass. This is the reason that our highly evolved altruistic emotions are associated with the we are emotions and behaviours of the collective consciousness. This is why our altruistic emotions have huge potential for the future collective protection for all of mankind if we can begin to take these messages seriously. Because imagine now if all 8 billion plus people function dominantly in our long-term memories through our altruistic emotions and behaviours of the collective consciousness. This is the reason that focused attention, mindful meditation can transform all of our lives if we can encourage a brand new team of neuroscience experts to begin to work together to help us all, to invent for us all some brand new, innovative, user-friendly, focused attention, mindful meditation practices and techniques that will allow neuroplasticity to begin to voluntarily retrain our long-term memories with 3 brand new levels of emotional adaptations. However, we mustn't forget one very important point, that all of these brand new practices will have to be user-friendly. In other words, able to be short, effective and focused enough to distract our ego emotions for long enough periods of time in order to allow neuroplasticity to begin making all of these positive transformations to become stored into our long-term memories. This is the challenge. But if we begin to forget everything else written throughout this book, we must not forget one extremely important reason for all of us to begin these emotional adaptations, the power of love. Because this first level of emotional adaptation will help us all to develop love for self. Because it's my firm belief that a large percentage of us have unfortunately been denied love for self, and we have already mentioned throughout the first half of this book the reasons and outcome of all of this denied love for self. The second level, however, is an entirely different kind of love. It is unconditional love, when we can all begin to live through a heightened sense of wellness, blissful happiness and healing within ourselves and each other. This is why love is the most powerful gift in the universe, and this is the reason that in this next very short chapter we are now going to discuss these 3 levels of emotional adaptation that will be based on the principles already discussed throughout this chapter. For example, how a brand new team of neuroscience experts can help us to invent some brand new user-friendly focused attention, mindful meditation practices for these 3 levels of emotional adaptation that will be short enough to be used by all of us, just like brushing our teeth each morning and night, but will help us all to access our working memory through voluntary neuroplasticity, together with the help of certain priming techniques.